All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I know I say this every single week that I'm excited to have my guest on, but I got to tell you, this book that we're covering today is probably one of my top read recommendations for 2018 out of the 40 or 50 or so that I have shared with you. And the reason is, in November, 40 years ago, so November 1978, there was one of the top mass murder / massacres in American history. It wasn't eclipsed until 9/11, where over 900 people died at the hands of a man named Jim Jones. Now, we've been hearing a lot about fake news in the news since the Trump election, a little beforehand, and CNN and all our friends that have journalism degrees. But I got to say, the most recent book that I've read, Cult City by Mr. Daniel J. Flynn, really is a story about fake news and how persistent 40 years of obfuscation and lies about an important cultural event like this could be. So I'd like to welcome him on. He writes for the American Spectator. I've been following his work for about a year now, and I'm a big fan, so I'm honored to have him on. Mr. Flynn, how are you?
Outstanding. Thank you for having me.
It's really great to have you. I got the cover of the book on here. I know you can't see it, but I'm going to show everyone what it looks like. This is Cult City. This is Mr. Jim Jones right here. Oh, wait, that's my notes. And so for people, you know, it's interesting. I was not born when this happened. So I've read about it as I've gotten older. And for people who are not familiar with it, let's get the 30-second overview of what most people know about this and talk about the 10-year labor of love that you've undertaken to tell the actual story behind the event.
Well, I first got interested in it when I was a very little boy, and I heard that over 900 people had killed themselves in the jungle at the behest of a guy named Jim Jones. And what set that off was a congressman, Leo Ryan, a Democrat from San Mateo County in California, went down to Jonestown, which was a commune in South America in Guyana, to investigate the conditions down there. The long and the short of it is that Jim Jones sent a squad out to assassinate the congressman, a group called the Red Brigade, and they killed the congressman, 3 journalists, and one of the members who had decided to leave. And that set off a chain reaction. And the long and the short of it is that you had over 900 people essentially ingesting or being injected with poison in Jonestown, and 4 people dying in Georgetown, also members of People's Temple. That, to me, when I was a little kid, that was the weirdest thing that I had ever heard. Like, why would all these people kill themselves just because some guy said it?
Right.
When I was an adult, I heard that Jim Jones had been made the Housing Commission Authority chairman in San Francisco by the mayor. The mayor appointed him to the commission, and he quickly became the chairman, effectively making him the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco.
It's crazy.
And I thought, wow, no, this is the weirdest thing that I'd ever heard of. Because when we think about guys like Jim Jones, I mean, we might think about Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy or Richard Speck or any of these characters that populate cable, murdertainment, I guess you'd say. You think of Jim Jones along with those characters, and you don't think of characters like that holding positions of civic responsibility. And so when I learned about Jones, having power in San Francisco, I thought, wow, this story just, is already the most interesting thing I'd ever heard, became a heck of a lot more interesting.
So let's do this. In the inside of your book here, one of the first lines is, in the Bay Area, you can see the young beset and preyed upon by vultures, wolves, and parasites, dope peddlers, pimps, lechers, perverts, thugs, cult mongers, and ideological seducers. Everywhere you look, you can see human beings rot before they ripen. That was Eric Hoffer, 1968. And as you read through the book, one of the things that becomes very clear is when they ask questions, how could this happen? How could people follow this man to their death? It had been happening for a decade, 15, 20 years before Guyana was ever a thing. And as I'm reading all these 40-year anniversary articles, it's shocking to me. I went from Mother Jones to Daily Beast. The questions are, could it happen again? What can we learn from this? Jim Jones, the radical right-wing maniac. None of what you write in your book is included in these articles. And I've gone on there and done a little bit of comment warrioring, if you will, and gotten in some arguments about it. But it's amazing. I'll just list out a 30-second snippet of here's all the things this article leaves out. And the reaction is usually, yeah, you're an insane conspiracy theorist. So how do the people listening to you and I today know that that's not you, that you're not some conspiracy theorist and you're lying about spending the last 10 years of your life interviewing new people, telling new stories, and basically uncovering the things that were never told about this story? How can we believe you, Daniel?
Well, the book is highly cited in the sense that, I don't know, 1,000 endnotes or something like that. And the source citations are generally from, either the California Historical Society, the archives where the People's Temple's papers are, Also the San Francisco Public Library, where Harvey Milk's papers are. So you have a lot of material that's original research, stuff that you can only get if you sit in a library for a long period of time combing through, old documents. Beyond that, I interviewed something like 30 people for the book, and it's not the easiest thing in the world, considering how many people died at Jonestown and how long ago that was, 40 years ago, to find survivors. And I found many survivors, people that were shot by Jim Jones's goons, people that were able to get out. I interviewed one of the only persons, one of three people who's still alive, who was in Jonestown at the time that the killings began and managed to get out. And there were about 9 people that got out, and he's one of 3 who's still alive. So I was able to talk to some pretty important people, including Jones's second in command for a while, who later became his public enemy number 1. So these were not peripheral figures. I mean, some of them were just rank and file members, but others were in the leadership. And then when you get to the Harvey Milk part of the equation, I certainly uncovered a lot of new material there by doing interviews with people who knew him, people who were political rivals, people that were involved in politics in San Francisco. So this is not a cut and paste job where you sort of Google your way to the answers. I mean, this was a book that was researched the old-fashioned way through interviews and through archives and things of that nature.
So there's a lot I want to cover here, but I think one of the things that I got into one of the biggest fights about was when I said, well, here's some things you should know. The Jim Jones People's Temple, perversion, sexual deviancy, drug use, suppression of speech and independent thinking, forced abortions, prostitution, child labor. They were anti-marriage. I think you cited that Jones said it was enslaving and suffocating. Voter fraud, racism, humiliation, muscle, intimidation, death squads, collectivism, including spouses. And of course, the showering of numerous awards by fellow travelers in leftism. And people go, I don't want to hear this. What made you decide to write this book? And let's start shattering some of the myths about the Jonestown massacre.
Well, I think, the big myth is that, people look at those people down in South America and say, wow, what a bunch of morons. How could they have drank the Kool-Aid? I think the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because before the poor drank the Kool-Aid in South America, the powerful did in San Francisco. And so we talked a little earlier about Mayor Moscone in San Francisco appointing Jones to the Housing Commission Authority, where he had, sway over 35,000 public housing units. The very people who would be attracted to People's Temple, people that were the urban underclass. That was where he was mainly getting his followers. Moscone said that Jones was a man who examined his conscience more thoroughly than any man he knew. So it is not as though Jim Jones was some peripheral figure in San Francisco. In fact, when Rosalind Carter came to campaign for her husband, Jimmy Carter, for president in 1976, she had Jim Jones introduce her. Jones had dinner with her. They talked on the telephone. She called him on the telephone. We know this because Jones surreptitiously recorded the conversation. She referred Jim Jones to her sister-in-law, the president's sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who was involved in the ministry, and Jones and her had discussions. And so in part, it was the people in San Francisco were in love with Jim Jones, but they also turned on national figures like Rosalind Carter. Walter Mondale, one of the first people he meets when he gets off the plane in San Francisco to campaign for the vice presidency in 1976, is Jim Jones. Governor Jerry Brown spoke at the People's Temple. Willie Brown was a frequent speaker at the People's Temple. He wrote a letter to Fidel Castro. Jones was planning to he did go to Cuba in 1977. And Willie Brown wrote Fidel Castro that he should extend a state visit to Jim Jones, as though Jones were head of state, and that Jones was a highly trusted brother in the struggle for liberation. Now, when you look at Willie Brown's memoirs that came out about 10 years ago, he writes in such a way as though he were sort of observing this all from a distance, that he did not really, Jones was basically a stranger to him, and he didn't know how he got so much power. Willie Brown was one of the main reasons why Jim Jones got so much power in San Francisco. And one of the reasons people in Guyana did not intervene is they kept getting letters from powerful politicians in the United States saying what a great guy Jim Jones was. So if you're receiving reports that there's plans of mass suicide and that there's a concentration camp being run in your country, and you're receiving these reports from people who are not anonymous, but just ordinary people. And then you're weighing that against the lieutenant governor of California, who took a trip to Jonestown, flew down there with Jim Jones, and he declared himself incredibly impressed by what he saw in Jonestown. He's seeing a concentration camp, but he's saying that it's so impressive. And so who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the people that have been entrusted with power in the United States, or are you going to believe these powerless people in South America? And unfortunately, the people in Guyana believed the Mervyn Dimilees, they believed the Willie Browns, they believed the Harvey Milks, and they did this. And unfortunately, disaster ensued.
Let's go back a little earlier. Let's talk about his upbringing, his beginning. I know that his parents were not that involved in his life from reading your book, but he was very active in church lifestyle, which is this whole idea of him being a religious right-wing fanatic comes from. But he had some really weird quirks and personality traits, and he was just an odd bird from the beginning. And then he went to college in Indiana and got really obsessed with Marxism, and that's kind of where this takes off. Take over. Tell us how it works.
Well, Jim Jones's father certainly wasn't much involved in his life. He was a World War I veteran who was effectively disabled and didn't really work much and was sort of passively involved in his life. His mother, I think, was quite heavily involved in his life in an overbearing sense. She was a very odd duck, to say the least, in Bible Belt, Indiana, in the Depression era. She really stood out because she did not go to church. She had very left-wing politics. She pronounced that she had been, various rich and famous people in past lives. She changed her name or changed her first name 3 different times. She wouldn't allow Jim Jones to enter her house unless she was in it. She wore, this doesn't strike as weird today, but she wore pants instead of, dresses or skirts. And that struck people as weird in Indiana at the time. The leaf doesn't fall too far from the tree. A lot of her beliefs she passed on to her son. And ultimately, her son demanded that his mother call him father, and she did. But back then, Jim Jones had this sort of weird upbringing. He was not involved in the church from an early age, but at a certain point, when he's 10, I talked to a kid who was 10 years old who was a friend of Jim Jones when they were growing up. The guy's, in his late 80s now. And he said that the real peculiar thing about Jones is they went to a local service. I think it was a Pentecostal service. And at the end of the service, the preacher says, does anyone want to get saved? Has anyone not been saved? And Jim Jones raises his hand. He goes up there and gets saved. The next week, he does the same thing. Does anyone want to get saved? Now, you're only supposed to get saved one time. But Jim Jones repeatedly kept getting back, going up to the altar and getting saved. And his friend found this really strange. And so the implication being that Jim Jones really liked the attention that he got at the church. And he later starts preaching to kids, preaching to animals, preaching to the trees in the forest when no one's listening. And he gets pretty good at that. And eventually he goes into ministry. And he asks himself what he said later, and Jim Jones is not always the best authority on Jim Jones, but he thought to himself, this is what he said, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? And he said the thought was to infiltrate the church. And I think at least in that sense, Jim Jones was accurately depicting why it is he got involved in the church. And it seems rather strange that you would, if you want to promote Marxism, that you would go into the church, but that's what Jim Jones did.
So let's move on from there and talk about one of the things that irked me when I was reading an article about how he was this Christian fundamentalist is the fact that in Indiana, they kind of caught onto his shtick, right? He had to leave there and go to a place where they'd be more accepting of kind of what a weirdo he was. And he also kidnapped someone, not only in Indiana, but when he left to Guyana. Talk to us about him going from Indiana to San Francisco.
Yeah, in Indiana, he, initially some people liked him. He was on the Human Rights Commission in Indianapolis, for instance. He bought airtime on WIBC, which is a station that still exists. But ultimately, people start hearing what he's saying, and he gets kicked off the airwaves. He starts to claim that, that he's being attacked, that people are throwing rocks through his church windows, even though the rocks, the glass is sort of breaking from the inside out. He says that people put glass in his food. He has all these, stories of persecution, and people buy into it. At a certain point, he wears out his welcome in Indiana. He goes down to Brazil. The church is sort of falling apart. He comes back to Indiana, and they decide to go out to California. And the reason given is that this part of California is one of the places on earth that would be least affected by a nuclear apocalypse. And of course, he's a prophet, and he predicts that there's going to be a nuclear apocalypse towards the end of the 60s, and that's why they go there. At least that's why they believe they go there.
That's before they called it global warming, right? He said it was going to be nuclear.
Yeah, he said that back then. That was the kind of prophecies that were given back then. In Indiana, there was a kid by the name of Thomas Bikeman, who I interviewed, whose mother was very much a devotee of Jim Jones, and his father basically hated Jim Jones's guts, but he loved his mother. And Jim Jones forced this woman to divorce her husband. He set her up with his second in command, who was, like a 50-something black man, and she was an early 20s white woman, which, is kind of an odd relationship.
Awesome.
She wanted this man to adopt her. I don't know how you would adopt a 20-year-old woman, but, he wanted this man to adopt the woman he was having an affair with. Ultimately, a court takes the kid away and awards him to his maternal grandmother, but Jim Jones isn't having any of that. And when they go out to San Francisco, they take this kid with them against the court order, and the father, follows suit, rejoins with the mother, and basically sticks with Jones because he wants to stick with his wife. He's in love with his wife.
Yeah, and this is a man, I believe you said he was not illiterate. Maybe he wasn't the smartest knife in the drawer. He just loved the woman, didn't want to leave her, didn't want to leave his kid, right? So what's he going to do?
Yeah, I think he may have been illiterate. I mean, he I don't know that I would say he was unintelligent. He just was not
uneducated,
schooled.
Air quotes.
Yeah, he was not. He didn't have much of an education. And the reason why this story is important is because, when they leave Indiana and go to California, it starts with a kidnapping. And when they leave California and go to Guyana, that starts with a kidnapping too.
So we go to San Francisco, and this is where you start talking about Harvey Milk. Now, I'm in my 30s. I didn't see the movie Milk, but I'm fascinated by all the information in this book that I had never heard before. The fact that this man has streets named after him, other government buildings, that Barack Obama either gave him an award or celebrated a day. I don't remember what it was because I'm reading all this for the first time. You've got the movie that won several Academy Awards, and I'm reading these pages going, this guy was kind of a dirtbag. Let me turn the page again. Yep. This guy was a loser. Why am I not shocked that he's worshipped by cultural icons today? Talk about the rise of Harvey Milk and some of his more favorable personality traits and characteristics, and how those coincide with meeting Jim Jones and how they helped each other.
Sure. Harvey Milk was a bit of a jack of all trades. He was in the Navy. He later claimed in San Francisco that he was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. That's probably the only city in the country where if you brag about being dishonorably discharged to get sort of political street cred.
Right.
But he wasn't. He got an honorable discharge from the Navy. He taught for a few years. He worked as a stock analyst on Wall Street. He worked on several Broadway productions of Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar. So he was kind of a wanderer at that point. And he was also a Goldwater conservative, ironically, in the 1960s. At the same time that he's passing out this Goldwater literature, he has a 16-year-old boy who he had plucked off the streets of Manhattan, moved him into his apartment, sought to get legal guardianship over the boy. But, he's having sex with a 16-year-old boy, and this relationship would last for years. And so that pattern of Milk going after really young guys, not all of them underage, but some of them underage.
Craig Rodwell, was that the first guy? Craig Rodwell?
No, well, that's a different guy. Craig Rodwell was later a very prominent gay activist, was involved in the Stonewall riots and involved with many gay organizations. He had a relationship with Milk, and Milk really freaked out because Rodwell was out front and active and proud about his homosexuality. And Milk was on Wall Street. He was still living in the closet. And their relationship ends. I think Milk contracts a disease from him. But beyond that, he's very freaked out that Rodwell was passing out literature to gay literature in people's mailboxes and things like that. And Milk thought, oh, no, I'm going to be found out if I stick with this guy. And he breaks up with him, and Rodwell attempts suicide. That also is a pattern with Harvey Milk's, a lot of his boyfriends, is a lot of them attempted suicide, and several of them unfortunately succeeded.
Yeah, it was really sad. I mean, you kind of catalog his life events. You go from being a Goldwater Republican to starting to live off the government and suggesting boyfriends come out, live with him. They can take unemployment and just travel around, have a good time. I think you said that his Photoshop, air quotes, I'll put my camera back on, Photoshop was in business for several years and lost the equivalent today of over $250,000 because he had a different business going on in the back where you could evade censorship of the photos you wanted to get taken. But
Well, there's a lot of speculation about what he was doing with the Photoshop, how he was, whether he was making money, the accounting is certainly very peculiar because he only showed 1 year where he was actually making money, and it was a real meager amount, I think $1,500.
right.
But he showed that he was losing a lot of money. Different people that I talked to said different things. One guy said, my sense is that they were selling pot out of the back of the store. Other people said, yeah, they if you wanted to get some dirty pictures, you wouldn't go to Walgreens or CVS or something like that. You'd go to Harvey because he would do that and you'd get reported if you went elsewhere.
Right.
So the business, really it was more of kind of like his Tammany Hall. He decided when he went to San Francisco that he was going to once again reinvent himself as a political figure. And this took many years to sort of, for him to that dream to sort of live up to its fruition. And Castro Camera was very helpful in that because he had it was sort of a meeting place for local people, and he did a lot of work establishing the Castro neighborhood as establishing a business group for the Castro neighborhood. So he was very active in the neighborhood, and he became thought of as a leader, and he basically was a bit of a local gadfly who would go to meetings and be a pain in the neck to the various politicians.
Yeah, you said he did care about people. He had good intentions, but he's a little slippery morally because he had the incident with Sipple, where Sipple essentially helped save Gerald Ford's life. I think it was a Ford or car. I forget who it was.
It was Ford, yeah. And, so this guy Bill Sipple was a friend of Harvey Milk's, and again, he was a very dim guy. But a good guy. He was a Vietnam vet, and he ends up with one of Harvey Milk's former boyfriends, a guy by the name of Joe Campbell, who, if you've heard the song Walk on the Wild Side, he's referenced in that song. He's also in a movie called My Hustler. And this reference, both of those are, things reference his life as a hustler. So Milk was basically having a transactional relationship with this younger guy who was, of age, but he was a younger guy, and he was essentially selling himself for money at various points in his life. Campbell gets in a relationship with Bill Sipple. And in 1975, in September, Gerald Ford travels to San Francisco, and a woman by the name of Sarah Jane Moore attempts to kill him. She gets a shot off, and she's not able to kill the president because Sipple basically hits the gun out of its trajectory, and I don't know if out of her hand, but she's able to get a shot off, but that's it. And so he's a big hero. Now, Sipple, who was out essentially in San Francisco, was not out to his parents, was kind of living the life of a private gay guy who didn't feel like he needed to tell everyone that he was gay. But in San Francisco, he was a gay guy. Back home, he was, Uncle Bill or whatever he was. Harvey Milk leaked his sexual orientation to the press, and Herb Cain, a local writer who later won the Pulitzer Prize and also a booster of Jim Jones, wrote about it and wrote this very thinly veiled piece letting everyone know that Oliver Sipple was gay. And I think Milk had two things that he wanted to do there. One was he wanted to let everyone know that Oliver Sipple was one of his supporters, and he was running for a supervisor position at that point. And the second thing he wanted to do was sort of give gays a good name, to let people know that gays can be heroes, they can do great things. And I think in trying to make life better for gay people, he really made life horrible for this one gay guy who was a friend. And it was a real act of perfidy. I spoke to Sipple's lawyer, who just noted how this whole event just upended his life, and also that he never really even suspected that Harvey Milk was the one that outed him.
Yeah, and you did a really good job summarizing, and I don't have it here, about how, he sacrificed the individual for the collective, which is a theme of the book, and that basically he was okay with doing that to other people when it suited his purposes. And whereas Sipple didn't want to, I think the other thing was, you said they accused Gerald Ford of lying about not actually giving him any recognition because he was gay, even though Ford was on vacation and wrote the letter 2 days later. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think the assassination attempt was on a Monday, and Ford wrote this letter of thank you, appreciation on a Thursday. And Milk, and still to this day, various historians act as though that Ford wanted nothing to do with this guy Sipple. It's just not true. I mean, there's a letter there. Sipple, his lawyer said he framed the letter. He was quite proud of it, didn't think that the president was an ingrate or anything like that. But Harvey Milk and others kind of went with the story for political reasons because they were supporting Carter and not Ford, or they were supporting the Democrat at that point, not Ford. And so they went out and acted as though Ford hadn't thanked him, and he did thank him. They said that he thanked him weeks later or a month later. No, he thanked him 3 days later. And so it was a real unkind thing that they did to Gerald Ford. And again, the common thread there is sort of ends justify the means. And that's kind of a thread of the book.
So yeah, and it basically just the things he was willing to do to harm people. So I want to get back to Jones and talk about how they correlate, but also it shows a trend that he had of, I think Milk would have fit in pretty well today, of this reductio ad Hitlerum, where he would accuse people like Jones of trying to assassinate him, trying to do horrible things to him, calling him Hitler. I think one of the examples you gave is that Milk had said, "We don't need Uncle Tom's, lead us to the gas chamber," which means he just had this precocious mixing of Hitler. He would go straight to Hitler all the time to build up his case, and that's why Jones found someone he could count on, kindred spirit, if you will.
Well, yeah, at around the time, a little bit after, Milk loses his second run for office in 1975. He really doesn't go anywhere in politics until he links up with Jim Jones. And this happens in 1976 when Milk is running for state assembly. Jones gives him a printing press. He gives him hundreds of volunteers to hand out his literature. He gives him a place at his pulpit if he wants to speak to his group of 1,000 or so people. There's all sorts of sort of in-kind contributions that Jones gave to Harvey Milk. And in turn, Milk gives Jones something I think far more valuable, and that is he gave him credibility. And when things start going south for Jim Jones, Harvey Milk is one of his most loyal allies, and we can probably get into that later. But he's really going overboard, writing world leaders, telling everyone what a great guy Jim Jones was, speaking at People's Temple when they're under attack. When it's already revealed that they're doing all of these misdeeds and crimes, he is still there when other politicians are running from Jim Jones. So I think in that kind of transactional politics that Jones and Milk shared, I think Jim Jones got the better end of the deal.
You talk in the book about how by 1973, let's say, the pretense of Christianity had already kind of been dropped, and it caused this fissure in the church in San Francisco where you had one group of guys who are pro-Marxist, pro-socialist looking at him going, we'll put up with the fake miracles and we'll deal with, all this preachy stuff you want to do, but we need to get back to the Marxism. Whereas the poor, uneducated black community in San Francisco, they had a different incentive. And you talk about the Gang of Eight and the Division and Lambrev and all these things that happened. Kind of take the audience through those events.
Well, in 1972, a guy by the name of Lester Kinsolving wrote an 8-part series for the San Francisco Examiner, really exposing People's Temple, basically outlining all of the things that San Francisco media didn't stumble upon until 5 years later,
Sure.
Saying that they were engaged in fake, welfare fraud, fake faith healings, that they were stockpiling weapons, that there was all sorts of bad things going on with People's Temple. Jim Jones is able to jettison most of that expose, and Kinsolving shortly thereafter loses his job. And so only 4 parts of that expose appear. And there's not a whole lot of damage done to the temple because of that. And Jones starts sort of cultivating various local leaders. The following year, a group of 8 young leaders within People's Temple decides to defect. And this really hurts Jones. And it's almost in microcosm, his reaction years later in Jonestown when people decided to leave. He really felt that these people were part of him, that he had such a narcissistic view that he felt that his followers were part of him. And when they left, he was being ripped apart. And so he really freaks out at that point, and he sends an airplane to look at the roadways to see where they are, tries to find out where they are, get them back. And one of the things he's afraid is that they're going to expose his secrets because they know what's going on in the temple. Later on, some of them do expose some of his secrets, but at that point, he's freaking out. Their point is that there's an obsession within People's Temple of sex to the exclusion of socialism. And aren't they supposed to be about socialism? Jones did get freaked out, but he didn't get freaked out enough to sort of curb his sexual appetites. And around that point, he impregnates a young follower, and there's a church rule that they're supposed to be getting abortions. She doesn't get an abortion. She sort of runs off and hides and comes back.
Most people who go to church know about that rule. That's very Christian.
Yeah, and so the other thing he does at that point is he goes to Los Angeles and he goes to see Dirty Harry. Maybe he thought that the movie was something different, the title meant something different, but he tries to solicit sex from an undercover cop by taking out his member and
he sues for false advertising. Yeah, he's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, and so he gets arrested, and he's able to quash that as well. So even though he had all these warnings that, look, guy, let's stop making this all about sex, he's sort of governed by these impulses and these compulsions, and he's not able to curb any of that. And eventually, it's the drug use as well is part of what really dooms him and dooms his flock.
Yeah, and then also you talk about how the people in the temple had to live by very strict rules in terms of diet and behavior, but probably the 12 to 15 articles I read, not one of them mentions not even hints to the fact that Jones was a homosexual, that he was into men.
Well, I don't know if I'd call him. He was sort of omnisexual.
Omnisexual.
I don't know. You can call. He had sex with men, so I guess technically maybe he was. But I think that when he had sex with guys in the temple, one of the interesting things that I discovered is that when I interviewed gay guys who were in people's temple, and I said, look, did Jones ever try to have sex with you? The answer was always no. He had no interest in having sex with guys who were interested in having sex with guys. He was very much interested in having sex with guys who had no interest in having sex with guys. In other words, this was a power thing for him. And I think he wanted to sort of humiliate people. A parallel to that would be there was a woman who was a vegetarian. He forced her to eat chicken. It's the same kind of thing. He's forcing people to do things they don't want to do. And after a while, if you keep getting forced into doing things that you don't want to do and you keep making compromises, you're all in and you'll sort of do anything for this guy. And that's kind of the way it played out.
True. I think your line was, at this point, if you're willing to accept certain things, there's nothing you'll turn down. And there was also, wasn't it a child who was forced to eat his own vomit several times at the dinner table? That's when I had to quit telling my wife what was in the book. She's like, stop, I'm done. Like, I don't want to hear anymore.
Yeah. The Consolving expose, one of the pieces that did not get published had that anecdote in it. And I interviewed a guy who witnessed this. And what he explained, and what Consolving explained as well, is that they went on a camping trip up in Oregon. There was a 4-year-old boy who found the food really gross. And, a lot of 4-year-old boys find all sorts of food gross.
Sure.
And he wouldn't eat it. And Jones said, eat the food. And he wouldn't eat it. And so Jones forced him to eat the food. The kid vomited. Jones forced him to eat his own vomit. He threw up again. Jones forced him to eat his throw up. And this went on. And so you get a glimpse into how sadistic this guy was, that he forces a 4-year-old boy to eat his own vomit. The part of the story that I thought was very interesting is that this boy's father was one of the members of the Red Brigade who murdered Congressman Leo Ryan and those others on the airstrip out of Jonestown. You would think that if you were a father of a 4-year-old boy and some other guy forced him to eat his own vomit, you'd want to fight the guy or you'd leave in a hurry that church. But if you don't leave, it sort of goes into what I just was saying, that you're sort of all in. That this guy has humiliated you to such a degree that there's really nothing you won't do for this guy. And of course, this boy's father killed for Jim Jones at a later date.
Wow. And then, just a couple of things I remember off the top of my head. They had people who would have to bend over and had their privates inspected by people in the temple. You had them slapping rear ends till they turned into red hamburger meat. You had basically him talking about the little boys in the room saying, careful, father's going to F-word you. And just that kind of thing. I'm like, I'm not reading a lot about this in the Christian fundamentalist critique of this guy. In fact, they're not talking about it at all. Why is that? So at the end, when they say, could this happen again? Yes, because Donald Trump is president. I go, just feel like that maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect here. Let's talk about his rise and his ascension in San Francisco, where I think I said earlier in the interview, this is the one place where he actually didn't seem like he wasn't all that normal. I'm going to hopefully interview Burroughs about his book called Days of Rage, about how crazy and dangerous it was to live in San Francisco at this time. But one of the questions I have for people online is, if there was a Christian fundamentalist in San Francisco who was accepted by the elite crop in the society, what kind of person would he be? What kind of things would he be advocating? What kind of behavior we expect from them? And this is kind of a preview of that, of exactly what that would be. Talk to us about how he ingratiated himself with society and why he ended up leaving, going to Guyana, which was originally a reward for good behavior before it was, hey, get over here or I'll punish you.
Yeah, it was sort of a nice place to go to rather than a concentration camp. In San Francisco, he really makes his mark. I mean, he's been around for a few years, definitely, but he makes a big mark in 1975 when he helps Mayor Moscone, or George Moscone, become mayor of San Francisco in a very close election. A lot of people suspect, most people think Jim Jones sort of tipped the election to Moscone's favor. And a subset of that group think that he did so because of shenanigans, that they had people who were not electors in the city of San Francisco casting ballots for Moscone, that Jones had busted people from Los Angeles and points out of the city to get them to vote for Moscone. And there's a lot of evidence that he did that. The interesting thing about that is once that Moscone gets elected, there's pressure to investigate whether the election was on the up and up. The guy who was assigned within the district attorney's office to investigate the election, the deputy district attorney, also happens to be Jim Jones's deputy. And so that's how in with the in crowd Jim Jones was in San Francisco, that when they come to investigate Jim Jones, the guy doing the investigation is a member of People's Temple, is one of the leaders of People's Temple. And of course, when he does the investigation, they find out that People's Temple has done nothing wrong. So that's how that's how tight they were with. I mean, it's not just that they were tight with who was governing San Francisco; they were part of who was governing San Francisco.
And as it becomes more popular, we'll get into how he left to Guyana. I just had a couple notes written down about people like Lambrev. His first convert to the church actually was a gay kid who was so who was so committed to him that even after Jones publicly humiliated him in front of the whole crowd, he remained faithful to him. Even after he questioned him about the gulags in Russia and got slapped down. Or you had another example of when he did the feeding of the 5,000, when he basically recreated the event in Matthew where they saw him running fried chicken in through the back door to make a pier to all these hungry people, that someone said, we shouldn't praise Jones, we should praise Colonel Sanders. And he was later poisoned to make an example. Let's talk about that and him going to Guyana.
Well, yeah, I mean, they ran out of chicken at some dinner after church, and Jones sent some people out to get, fried chicken, I think from Kentucky Fried
KFC,
Chicken.
right?
And that's right. And so they come back and they say, well, it's a miracle. We have all this chicken. And he calls it the blessed chicken. And one of his followers said the only one who's blessed that chicken is Colonel Sanders. And that's the same guy whose son was kidnapped by Jones from Indiana. So he's a guy who really hates Jones. And they know this guy loves lemon meringue pie. And so when they feed him a piece of lemon meringue pie, it's poisoned. And he goes into the bathroom, for an hour and reemerges white and looks like a ghost. And everyone thinks, well, this is what happens when you blaspheme God, essentially. When you sort of take on Jim Jones, all these strange things are going to happen to you. But little did they know that Jones had people poisoning him, just as he had people go out and buy chicken and sneak it through the back door. So there was all sorts of just events like that are really scary in and of themselves, but they didn't lead to people. If they did, when these events did lead to people leaving, it also served Jim Jones's ends, because you had independent thinkers, independent minds leaving the church, and the people who were left behind were the true believers.
So some of the things that stand out about Guyana, or I wrote a snippet down here where it was already a socialist country. It was an English-speaking country, but it was a perfect place for a more egalitarian, air quotes, society, free of racism, homophobia, sexist gender roles, all things that Jim Jones preached about a lot. But you refer to it as a concentration camp. And you also mentioned some interesting facts that he would pipe Angela Davis?
Sure.
That before Leo Ryan got there was order or proclamation number 75, order 66, where they were to give their original names instead of these socialist names like Lenin and Che Guevara, etc., that they were using on the compound. Harvey Milk talked about how they were solving the world's hunger crisis, yet they were starving there. It was a horrible place to try to have farming and to keep people fed. And one of the things that I read that was really crazy is that after the killing, it was the Russian media, I think it was Pravda or something, actually was making fun of Americans that we were putting in the press that this was a religious combine when it actually was a socialist communist concentration camp. They were mocking us about how stupid we were, or our media is, to peddle this lie that there was anything going on here other than socialism. So break down for us some of the myths that there are existing about Guyana.
Well, one of the interesting things about Jonestown that I heard from two different survivors was that in Jonestown, Jones confiscated anyone's personal Bibles. I mean, a lot of personal possessions were confiscated, but Bibles certainly, you couldn't have those in Jonestown. They were banned. They changed Christmas Day. They didn't celebrate it anymore. Jones gave no more sermons in Jonestown. There was no pretense about it being a Christian group at all once they get to Jonestown. Those Bibles get redistributed in Jonestown only when they run out of toilet paper. And the members are instructed on how to use those Bibles in the bathroom. So I don't, it's interesting to me that in the aftermath of Jonestown, you have the New York Times saying, well, he was sort of into social activism, but he was a preacher of fundamentalist Christianity, is the way they put it. I don't know any fundamentalist Christians that used the Bible as toilet paper, but they did that in Jonestown. The Associated Press said that they were religious zealots. They were not that at all. And as you point out, a lot of them changed their name to Lenin or Stalin. They changed the baby's name to Che. There was one guy who, they had these boxing matches where they would pit very powerful men against, weaker people and beat them up as punishment and also as entertainment for everyone. And there was one guy who was particularly good, and he changes his name to Ken Norton. And of course, at that time, Ken Norton was one of the best heavyweights in the world. And so they changed the name to all sorts of, white people would take on African names, but, a lot of people take on Jim Jones's name, but a lot of them changed their name to things like Stalin or Lenin or Che to sort of pay homage to communists.
And then, so it's kind of like this Twisted Office episode married with Lord of the Flies, right? The decline of their civilization. Talk about when there's a lot of myths surrounding the actual killing of these people. We talk about how there were guns put to their head. I'll go back to Leo Ryan in a second, but you talk about this idea of revolutionary suicide and how in the tapes, they're actually praising Jim Jones for the opportunity to make the great sacrifice for the cause.
Yeah, there's certainly a debate whether, these people were killed or whether they committed suicide. To go back a little bit, Jim Jones in 1975, he starts doing something called the wine test. And I interviewed two people who were present. And at the wine test, he served wine, which was very unusual because they weren't supposed to drink alcohol. And after they finished the wine, he told the various members of the planning commission, the leadership of People's Temple, that they were all going to die within 45 minutes, that he had poisoned them. And at that meeting, one woman starts freaking out, and someone pulls a gun and shoots her, or at least it makes it seem like they shot her. And ultimately, she's kind of shunned, and the people don't die. And so the lesson there is, look, just do what he tells you to do. You're not going to die. And if you rebel, something really bad will happen to you, like this woman. I spoke to a woman at that meeting who still believed all these years later that this woman, was freaking out and not acting at Jim Jones's request. But she was, in fact, acting at Jones's request. They didn't actually shoot her. They had blanks in the gun. So Jones was conditioning people with suicide. And in Jonestown, it becomes something called white knights. And what a white knight is basically the siege mentality where that Jones cultivates, where the people believe that there are these shadowy groups beyond the perimeter of Jonestown that are shooting at them, that are ready to invade any moment. And when they invade, they're going to kill all the kids, and they're going to slaughter everyone. And these white knights, Jones sort of pushes the idea that pretty soon we're all going to have to kill ourselves. And so the idea kind of, like cooking the frog, it sort of slowly gets introduced to the people in Jonestown. Jonestown is 100 miles away or so from the capital city. It's out in the jungle, surrounded by jaguars and spiders, or at least the people think there are all sorts of monsters in the woods, in the jungle. It'd be very hard to escape there. So they're basically trapped. And when they're there, they're getting these messages over the loudspeaker from various figures in the United States, including Angela Davis, Huey Newton, who are ginning up paranoia. They're basically saying that, we realize there's a big, profound conspiracy against you. We're standing with you. So they're basically supporting Jim Jones's line. In the meantime, in Jonestown, Jones is using the loudspeakers, 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. When he runs out of, energy to address the people with his propaganda, he's playing tapes of himself. And he's giving all these false reports saying that black people are being rounded up in the United States and all sorts of bad things are happening back home. You should be really grateful to be here. And, they don't have any communication with people back home. They don't have telephone. They're not watching television or anything like that. So who are they to believe? And they say a lot of them essentially believe Jim Jones is God. So they believe him. And it's within that context that revolutionary suicide happens on November 18th, 1978, that they are very much conditioned into the idea of killing themselves. Certainly on that death tape, you hear great enthusiasm for what Jim Jones is unleashing. The only people, there's one woman, one adult woman by the name of Christine Miller, who takes Jones on, and rather effectively takes Jones on with using logic, using great courage to take Jones on. But people shout her down, they charge her, they try to harm her, and ultimately she sort of acquiesces to what Jones wants to do. Other than her, the only people who are resisting are kids, and because maybe they have some wisdom beyond their elders. But in the people who saw it, who witnessed it and survived, who were very few, they noted that they didn't see anyone resisting, that they weren't being forced to take it, no one was getting injected, that they were taking the poison voluntarily. And certainly the death tape buttresses that idea, that they did so willingly, not just willingly, but enthusiastically. This notion, this idea of revolutionary suicide, Jones gets this from Huey Newton. Huey Newton writes a book in 1973 called Revolutionary Suicide. Jones takes that concept and basically presents it to the people in Jonestown that if they all kill themselves en masse, this is what he calls it is a protest against the inhumane conditions of the world. And that they would be basically making this big statement that the world is messed up. Rather than Jonestown's messed up, the world's messed up.
Right.
And that revolutionary suicide would be this big protest against the world, and everyone would sort of stand back and take notice. Obviously, history hasn't recorded it the way that Jim Jones wanted it recorded.
I think it's worth noting that Leo Ryan, who I didn't know much about before writing the book, was actually one of the comments on another YouTube video he did was the last politician to actually risk something for his people. The guy had a habit of getting his hands dirty, going in and trying to do his job, and in this case, it got him killed. Tell us a little bit about Leo Ryan.
Leo Ryan was a San Mateo Democrat, and like you say, he got his hands dirty. He became a substitute teacher in the Watts area of Los Angeles after they had riots there to sort of investigate conditions. He got himself imprisoned. I think that, I don't know if it was Folsom or I forget exactly which California prison, one of the big ones, but he got himself in prison to investigate the conditions there. He was not afraid of really, becoming involved in his job. And he was, one of his friends from way back told him that his son had died the day after he left People's Temple, and he died under mysterious circumstances. Jones claimed to his people that he murdered this guy. He may have been just making that boast. He may not have murdered the guy.
Sure.
But Leo Ryan took this seriously and started hearing all sorts of bad things about what was happening in Jonestown. One of the myths about Jonestown is that this just sort of happened in a vacuum and everyone was sort of taken aback by it. There were reports in the press talking about the possibility of mass suicide at Jonestown more than 6 months before it happened. So it's not as though this went on, that people didn't talk about it. There were repeated complaints to the State Department, who I would say they did nothing, but really they acted on behalf of Jim Jones. They really helped People's Temple, giving them sort of inside dirt on who was coming to see them and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of dereliction of duty in the press, in Jimmy Carter's administration, but not from Leo Ryan. And he, this is a story that has very few heroes, and certainly Leo Ryan is a big hero in this story.
And as we wrap, I want to talk a little bit about that dereliction of duty and the 40 years that have gone by and breaking this bubble of fake news. One of the things that caught my attention is how little, I forget what movie line it is, where they talk about, maybe it's Count of Monte Cristo, where we put the people we're ashamed of. These are the memories we don't want to remember.
Yeah.
And there, in terms of memorials, in terms of, everyone has their wristband for awareness. Everyone has their thing that we have to have a day for. Jonestown hasn't had that for 40 years. These people haven't had the accolades. We haven't heard their stories. Maybe they've done some things in the Bay Area, but they just have too much invested. There are too many quote unquote smart, influential people who are completely embarrassed by this, that they don't want anything to do with it. You mentioned Willie Brown earlier. There's a whole section in your book talking about how in the San Francisco fire in the early 20th century, they warned people for years and years. And I forget the gentleman's name who did the work and said, we're going to have a big, big problem with the water source if we have an earthquake. And all the people that died and the city burned down, no one ever went to prison. No one was prosecuted. And you kind of bring this into the theme of when you have these powerful, corrupt people protecting each other, that's just what happens. And the people who get hurt are the ones that trust these lunatics the most and trust that the government is going to step in and do their jobs and protect them. And it doesn't happen. And then you go through the litany of examples from the press of all the ways they spun this afterwards and didn't really mention what the real problem was. So kind of take the viewers down that route and how we got here 40 years later, where most of the stuff you talked about, they probably never heard before.
Well, in San Francisco, there's no memorial for People's Temple. It's in Oakland. And, as Gertrude Stein put it, there's no there in Oakland, and there's no there in Oakland for People's Temple either. So it's very unusual that they would have their memorial in Oakland. What's also unusual is it says that, dedicated to the victims of Jonestown. One of the names listed on the plaques is Jim Jones. He's certainly not a victim of Jonestown. So there's a lot of controversy over that memorial being in Oakland and not San Francisco, over the bodies being buried in Oakland and not San Francisco. But I think worse than that is that all of the aiders and abettors of People's Temple were celebrated after Jonestown. People acted as though they had never had any contact with Jim Jones. I mean, think about a guy like Harvey Milk, who wrote the President of the United States that Jim Jones was a man of the highest character. That's what he was thought of in San Francisco. That in this kidnapping dispute where Jones had taken a little 6-year-old boy from the Bay Area.
Stone? Is that what was his name?
John Victor Stone. And brought him down to Guyana. His parents are in the United States. Milk tells the President of the United States in this letter that his mother is essentially a blackmailer and his father is a teller of bold-faced lies. And so Milk went on a crusade writing the Prime Minister of Guyana, saying, such greatness I have found in People's Temple. He wrote the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, that People's Temple was a beautiful retirement community, the likes of which people of means would pay thousands of dollars to join. And all this is just propaganda. And now they're naming the Terminal 1 at San Francisco Airport in Milk's honor. And he has all sorts, he has a Navy ship named in his honor. This part of the story is not getting told. Mayor Moscone, who dies, is assassinated with Harvey Milk on November 27th of 1978. That's sort of the second part of the big story in the book. He has all sorts of buildings named after him in San Francisco. People don't talk about how he appointed Jim Jones to the Housing Commission Authority. That Jones and him were great political allies. Willie Brown has a bridge named after him. Herb Cain, they gave him a Pulitzer. In 1996, they called him the voice and conscience of the city. He was one of the big boosters of Jim Jones. You think about someone like outside of San Francisco, like Jane Fonda, who attended People's Temple on occasion, and she wrote after attending one service that she wrote Jim Jones that she wanted to be a full and active participant in People's Temple, and she wanted to do so for the sake of her 2 kids. Nobody asks Jane Fonda, why did you join People's Temple? They ask her about her, a lot of indelicate questions about her facelifts and her going to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, North Vietnam. But they never ask her about her involvement with Jim Jones. And Jim Jones, of course, regarded her as a member, said so. And I don't think Jim Jones was wrong about that. If you read her letter, it certainly looks to me like she was telling him, I'm joining your church. So he also defended Jim Jones after that. Very publicly put out a public letter defending Jim Jones when he was under attack from the press in San Francisco. So a lot of these people ran interference for Jim Jones. I think the worst example of all in San Francisco, worse than Milk, worse than Willie Brown, was this guy Carlton Goodlett, who was a local publisher and power broker. He was defending Jim Jones even after Jonestown. Said I could find no bad in this man. He lived as the embodiment of Christian principles. He said all sorts of great things about him 2 days after on TV. And he was still attacking Leo Ryan. He was still attacking the press who had exposed Jones. He was still attacking the concerned relatives who were wanting to get their family members back. But he had really nothing bad to say about Jim Jones. The amazing part of that in another city, that's going to kill your career. But in San Francisco, they've named the most prominent street address in the city after Carlton Goodlett. City Hall is one Carlton v. Goodlett place. The Board of Supervisors unanimously named it so about 20 years ago, or 20 years after Jonestown. I just find it amazing that they've really disrespected the people who died in Jonestown by sort of relegating the memorial to Oakland. And all of the people who aided and abetted Jim Jones are, they have monuments for them in San Francisco, and nothing for Leo Ryan that I know of in San Francisco. There's some stuff outside of the city, but that's the real hero of the story. There's nothing memorializing him. He saved people's lives that were living in the Bay Area. Why don't you praise him instead of Carlton Goodlett or Harvey Milk or Willie Brown? And I think that's kind of the upside down world that is San Francisco, and certainly the upside down world that was San Francisco in the 70s that allowed a guy like Jim Jones to rise to power, where I think in any other American city, he'd have been run out of town.
And that's one of the many themes that's going to make people want to tear their eyes out while it's just as you're talking about it, I remember the pages where I read this stuff and went, oh, I hope this isn't true. It's just so ridiculous. And so when people talk about what you open with, how are these people so foolish? How could they do this? How could they trust someone? It really is a question of bad judgment. But he thrived in a city full of successful people that exercised horrible judgment and paid no price for it after it was over. So when people talk about Jonestown, for those of you listening, and ask that question, just remember, Jim Jones knew his audience. I don't know if it was you, Daniel, or someone in an article who read that he actually was a pioneer. He was way ahead of his time. He knew how to manipulate people. He knew when people were dupes. And he started with the elite of San Francisco. They were the dupes. They were the ones who were so married to their ideology that they weren't willing to ask any important questions. And 918 plus people died for it. So I want to thank you very much for your time. I've got pages and pages of notes. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully those of you listening are enticed to go out and buy this book. Of all the interviews I've done in 2018, this is a must buy. This is a book you need to buy. You need to read it. You need to be familiar with the material because there are themes that are important in terms of also the thing we didn't talk about is him telling people that he was God, that socialism was our God, and that he called Christ a dumb sky god who ought to be raped. He was obsessed with sex. He hated God. He was a socialist, atheist, omnisexual, whatever you called it earlier. And there's a lot to be learned from the fact that the ideas he espoused are, you could argue, much more popular now than they were at the time that these people died for them.
Well, thank you for that big endorsement, and I appreciate the interview.
All right. Daniel Flynn, you can check him out. American Spectator. He has some other good books, but start with Cult City, and you can find him on social media. Make sure you go out and pick it up and support his work. Daniel, thank you for your time, and thank you so much for the excellent book.
Thank you so much.